Alright, hello everyone and welcome to In Contrast. My name is Alan.
And I'm Nisha.
And on this podcast we talk about movies and the books that they're based on.
The catch is you watch the movie and I read the book, with some exceptions.
Today we're doing something slightly different than we've been doing in the past, and that's basically just because the movie is not very well known. Up to this point we've done some very well-known movies and well-known books, but in this case the written work is much more well-known than the movie. And so today we're going to be talking about the Call of Cthulhu.
By H.P. Lovecraft. And I bet a lot of people didn't even know there was like a pretty faithful adaptation. There's a ton of spin-offs like Call Girl of Cthulhu, which we considered. But yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those strange things where it's such a prominent thing in our culture and pop culture. Like, a lot of people know about Cthulhu and the mythology around it. Even if they don't know a ton, it's something that's on people's radar. Even if they haven't read the story, it's just something that's pervasive throughout so much of like science fiction and mystery and stuff like that. You know, it's basically spawned its whole genre of Lovecraftian. But then to have this very, very popular story by him with not a well-known movie at all. I mean, very few people, I think, have seen this movie. It's just kind of interesting.
Yeah. So before we get too deep into all of that, let me talk a little bit about Lovecraft. And I do want to address that he had some unsavory takes, to put it lightly. And we probably won't unpack all of that, but his writing is basically steeped in racism.
Like, everyone was a little racist back then, but I think he had a lot of people beat.
He was particularly peculiar. Excuse the alliteration. Anyway, he was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1890, and he died by suicide at 46 in 1937. I didn't actually know he died by suicide. I knew he died young, but I didn't know that. His father was institutionalized when he was just 3 years old. His mother was then overly doting after his father's death, and they moved in with her father, I believe. Later, his mother would be institutionalized when he was just 23 in 1913. He had a huge fear of having mental breakdowns, obviously, because both his parents were having psychological issues. And there's some debate about if his mother's mental breakdowns were actually because of syphilis. Something interesting. I didn't look into it too much. During his life, he actually was not very well known, and he published a lot in pulp magazines, including the Call of Cthulhu, which was originally published in Weird Tales in 1928. Some parts of that story were actually based on dreams he had, and he was plagued by nightmares. But I think it's really safe to say his work really reflects him.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, I guess that's not an uncommon thing for creators like this, especially when they're, you know, coming up with something so unique. It tends to come from a dark place in the mind, but...
Yeah, absolutely. And I know he also suffered from a lot of anxiety and agoraphobia. I wouldn't be surprised if some of that was because he's extremely xenophobic and racist, and was in turn coddled rather than challenging those ideals in a healthy and safe way. Like, as someone who also has anxiety and agoraphobia, I don't hate people who are not like me.
Right. Things tend to be looked at a little differently back then. At least now we have, you know, names and, like, resources for things like that. And
yeah.
I guess that was his only outlet.
Yeah, and something I noticed when looking at him and his bio, do you know what the Habsburg lip is?
Yeah.
So for those who don't know, it's this extremely prominent, like, underbite and, like, very large jaw that you get from incest and inbreeding in humans. It's called the Habsburg lip. There are a few other names, but it's called the Habsburg lip because the Habsburg family was so well known for it. He looks like he's got a Habsburg lip. And I didn't look into it, but I have questions.
I mean, back then there's no telling what could have happened with any of that. He's always been, like, kind of an odd-looking person, especially, like, his jawline to me, but I never really thought of it that way.
Yeah, I looked at the photo of him when I was on Wikipedia yesterday, and I was like, that dude has a Habsburg lip.
No,
I mean...
That's probably it.
Yeah, I'm no expert, and I did not look into this. This was entirely speculation.
Pure conjecture, but...
But, looking at his face, that's what it looks like.
Seems likely.
So the story The Call of Cthulhu is broken up into 3 parts. It's first-person past tense and revolves around Francis Thurston after finding his great-uncle's notes when asked to settle his estate, which means that his great-uncle, Angle, I believe his name is pronounced, is dead. It follows Thurston as he uncovers more in the notes and does his own research, starting in Providence, Rhode Island, which you might recognize as being Lovecraft's birthplace, but it does travel to New Zealand, and I think it's Norway.
In the movie, it's Greenland. I'm not sure.
No, they definitely don't travel to Greenland in the story, and that's a difference that I know why they go to Greenland.
Okay.
So we'll talk about that. They do talk about Greenland in the story, but Thurston does not go to Greenland.
Oh, maybe that's what it is.
Yeah.
He doesn't go there himself, but someone else does.
The first part is about the dreams and Wilcox, the sculptor, who creates a bas relief of Cthulhu, and Thurston's extreme skepticism about all of this, and if Wilcox was just taking advantage of Angle, Thurston's great-uncle. The second part is about what kind of happens to Angle. Oh, actually, I should also say the first part revolves heavily around dreams. Mm-hmm. The second part talks about what happened before Wilcox met Angle. And it shares the story of Inspector Legrasse, who finds or procures another statuette of Cthulhu. And that is really where the racism starts coming in big time. And then I believe the third part is mostly about him investigating himself. And that's when he goes to New Zealand and Norway. And then in the end speculates about how he's going to die. Most interestingly about the story is it actually starts with him saying that these papers, so it's like a first-hand, like epistolary basically, that these papers, the story, were found among the late effects of the late Francis Thurston. Mm-hmm. So you know he's dead from the beginning.
Yeah.
Is that kind of how the movie goes?
It does jump around a little bit. I mean, it starts with his uncle the same way, who's kind of, he gives him these documents, he sort of tells him a few stories, and then he moves on and starts investigating. I don't remember it ever mentioning that he died at the beginning. I'll get into more of the style of the film itself, but another important thing to remember is there's not a ton of dialogue because it is a silent film. So there's only, there's the typical 1920s silent film dialogue where it's just written on the screen, but it's pretty light because of that.
So actually, let's talk about that because I think that's going to set a lot of context for comparing the plot.
Yeah.
So this movie, it was made in 2005.
Right.
But it's silent and in black and white.
Right, yeah. They very much decided to make it that old feel because they felt like... we should just go ahead and say, this was long considered to be an unfilmable story. That's part of the reason why there's not a ton of adaptations, even though Cthulhu and this story and pieces of it are found in media across the years and across, different mediums. But, it was never considered to be something that could be filmed directly. There's other movies that take pieces of it, but this is the only adaptation that's, actually a close adaptation from the written work. This is the idea that they came up with. It was created by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, who aren't tied to the estate of H.P. Lovecraft or anything like that. They're pretty much just a group of nerds that love Lovecraft.
They're a fan club.
Yeah, they put on stage productions. They've done some other written works that exist in the world and various other things, but they consider themselves a group of role players. But
wait, do they really consider themselves a group of role players?
Yes. And I want to say that I didn't look into this part, but I think it's because one of the more popular mediums for Call of Cthulhu was a tabletop role-playing game. So I'm pretty sure that they formed out of that.
Fascinating.
And then went on to create these other things. But anyway, so they about 20 years after their formation, they finally got this movie put together. It's a pretty low-budget affair, but all things considered, it really works well.
Interesting.
I loved the idea to do that silent film, and they definitely blend like modern technology with the old style of filmmaking, and it's pretty effective from what I could tell. I mean, one thing to mention is that I did have to watch a pretty poor quality version of it because that's all that's available unless you like order the DVD directly from them. It's not on like any streaming services. I mean, this is a really like pretty underground movie as far as movies go.
I think we will order the DVD.
I would be very curious too.
To like full disclosure, we didn't have the time to order the DVD, but yeah, I think we will order the DVD.
Yeah, it's a worthwhile watch, and I mean it clocks in at about 45 minutes, so it's definitely a short film. But yeah, it pretty much hits all the story points as far as I can tell, and I love the style. It's very much like harkening back to that 20s style specifically with like the backgrounds, they're kind of wacky and expressionist, a lot like the German expressionist silent films of the 20s, and like reminded me a lot of like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari would probably be the most well known in that style, and it really, really works for this type of story.
Okay, so let's talk about the story then. Mm-hmm. You just said Professor Engel is alive at the beginning of your movie.
Yeah.
He's not. He is dead at the beginning of the book. So that sounds like a huge difference already, is that Thurston in the story, which I may keep calling a book, it's a short story, but he finds all of this in boxes, and one of the boxes is locked, and he has to like use the ring that Professor Engel always kept on him to unlock it. But it sounds completely different in the movie.
Somewhat different. It's a little unclear to me. Maybe it was just me not paying attention, but I'm not sure if it was like because it just jump around a little bit. So it may have just been going off of like his memories, and technically he was dead already in the story, but there is a scene where he, talks to him and sort of gets some of the details about this stuff, and that he mentions, hey, like, this is a mystery that I have in, like, all these documents and stuff, and there is part that he gets right away, and then part that he has to kind of uncover later, but, yeah.
That's really interesting, and I think that shows a good knowledge of how the two mediums work differently, because written word is so easy to be like, and then I found this letter, and here's what the letter said. You can't do that in a film.
Right.
Because so in the movie, evidently, Thurston was told about these mysteries by Professor Engel. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the story, Professor Engel locks all of this stuff up. It's clear that he does not want people to find these papers, in fact.
He does actually specifically warn Thurston not to investigate it.
Okay, yeah. So there is, again, really smart choices where this is going to work better in this medium, whereas this will work better in a different medium. Yeah. So I think that's really cool. Is the movie broken up into 3 parts?
Yes.
So the first part, I'm guessing, is also about Wilcox and the bas relief.
Yeah.
Okay. And that, I'm guessing, must be pretty similar. Basically, Wilcox has a dream at night, and he, like, wakes up and finds he's been creating this bas relief or something like that, or he recreates what happened in his dream.
Right.
And it has, the depiction of Cthulhu, and then this text at the bottom that is not a recognizable text.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all the same in the
It
film.
is.
Yeah.
So something I'm really curious about, what does the bas relief look like? Like, how would you describe Cthulhu?
That's a good question. I mean, it's fairly, like, blocky.
Yeah,
so
and you watched it in 360p.
Right, so it's hard to explain any, like, significant detail on it. But yeah, it's a figure, I don't know, maybe, like, 8 inches by 4 inches on the face, and then it's kind of just this, like, little face, of, like, a kind of squid-looking monster.
Yeah.
With some of the tentacles coming down the side, kind of carved. But generally, it's just like a little block, and then he's kind of like short and stubby.
So one of my big questions is that so every portrayal you see of Cthulhu, he's either and I don't know if Cthulhu uses he/him pronouns, but that's what we're going to go with. Cthulhu is either like a squid or an octopus or a squid octopus man.
Mm-hmm.
In the story, he's described... Oh, let me find the excerpt. He's described as an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature. And then there's another one where he's described as a pulpy, tentacle-headed, surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings, but it was the general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion of Cyclopean architectural background. Mm-hmm. So Cyclopean is used a lot in the book, and I had no idea what that meant. It's basically the, like, big stones, like when you see a big stone wall with, like, big stones and little stones, and, like, They might not even be put together with masonry. That's Cyclopean architecture. Okay. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting that I have never seen a depiction of Cthulhu that evoked a dragon, or scales, or wings.
Well, he often has wings in depictions.
That's true. Okay, wings, yes, but I don't see a lot. You know what, actually? I cannot believe I'm about to say this. Cthulhu Saves Christmas, the game.
Pretty accurate.
Pretty accurate, actually, because it does have the wings. He looks a little bit dragony and then a little bit octopusy. Yeah. But that's what I was curious about in the movie. Do you feel like they captured the human octopus dragonoid?
Well, yeah. So I don't know. I can't even actually remember if I've read this story before. I may have long ago. If not, I know like a lot of the bits and pieces of it, but I don't remember if they specifically come across Cthulhu himself in the story.
No, there are some people who show up on a boat and they, I believe, encounter him, but it's like a third-hand account for Thurston.
Right. This is on the Emma ship?
I think it's called the Alert.
Oh, yeah, okay. So the Alert was like the secondary ship off of the Emma.
Oh, was
it?
So
yes,
yeah.
You're right. The Alert is the one that actually gets to the island.
I only know this because I took a quiz, and it told me that I got the ship's name wrong when I put in the Emma,
right.
And it was the Alert. So I'm glad you remember that detail, because I did not.
That is very succinctly and directly explained in the film. So
okay, it's explained in the book too, but full disclosure, I listened to the book a while ago, and then I tried reading it again, and I got like halfway. I did do a lot of spark notes and stuff, and like I said, I took a quiz and I got 68% on it. So
I mean, the fact of the matter is, for this story, the story itself isn't that important.
It's not.
It's all, once again, about the vibes. This created this created like such a subgenre of science fiction and fantasy and whatever you want to call it. It's really kind of its own thing, but that's really the point.
Yeah, I think that's not to like skip ahead to a different section, but I think that's really interesting because I wouldn't say I found the story particularly scary. I wouldn't know how to shelve it because I feel like it's more of a mystery thriller. But then when you have monsters like Cthulhu and the unknown and eldritch horrors and all that stuff, it kind of is horror. And I think that's why Lovecraftian became its own genre. Yeah. And in my opinion, Lovecraft doesn't really deserve to have a whole genre named after him. Because, I mean, one, he was racist. And two, I don't think he was actually that great of a writer. I think a lot of the new takes are so much better than what he could have ever done. But he laid a strong foundation for us to build on.
And that's really important. I mean, even if he's not a strong writer himself, that's why I find it so fascinating, because he's not a strong writer.
Yeah.
But he had ideas that were very, very creative, and so, I mean, yeah, possibly someone else would have come up with this kind of thing eventually, but
yeah,
it was pretty unique for its time, and it really informed a lot of stuff going forward. So
yeah, it's kind of like how the band The Beatles are not very good, but a lot of people are like obsessed with them, and it's because they laid a lot of groundwork.
You're just really coming in with the hot takes
today. I am, and I feel like I should, full disclosure, let me just see if I can illustrate how big my book is for H.P. Lovecraft. Yeah, we have the gain turned way down, and that just peaked the microphone. So I have the complete works of H.P. Lovecraft, and that's because I'm a horror writer, and I recognize his importance. I still think he is okay, I don't like swearing, but I think he's a piece of shit.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to say it. I think he's a piece of shit.
Right.
So.
Still has his place in history.
Has his place in history.
Both of those things can be true.
So does Hitler.
Well, sure.
You know? Lots of people have their place in history. And no, Lovecraft was not on par with Hitler, frankly.
Absolutely not.
Lovecraft lacked the confidence. Okay, this is getting totally way off the rails. I'm so sorry.
Back to the story.
As we drop everything. Okay, so the first part, Wilcox. Is there anything else you want to add about the first part?
No, there was nothing, like, particularly that jumped out about it. It's really just kind of, showing the weird vibes start. It kind of starts to show Thurston's, like, obsession with this mystery, and then it moves on.
Does Thurston express skepticism or appear skeptical of Wilcox? Because in the story, he's like, I bet Wilcox knew about the original stuff. Which they haven't talked about yet, but he's like, he knows about the old man's history, and he's playing head games.
I don't remember that being... It may have been said in the film, but it is not, like, a major point or anything. If he says stuff like that, it's not directly going at Wilcox, and it's almost like what I got out of it is that it's almost like him being in denial about it.
Yeah. Yeah, he's definitely in denial, but I would say in this one, he's very much like... he thinks Wilcox is taking advantage of Professor Angle.
Mm-hmm. No, that's not a main point of the movie at all.
But they do talk a bit about the dreams in the first part too, and how predominantly artists have these weird dreams, and one of them has such bad dreams. And it's like a period of time from like March to April 2nd or something like that, where they have all these weird dreams, and one of them actually has like a terrible fit and dies because of it.
Right.
And that's, like, wild. How did they portray all these dreams? Because you said the dreams was a theme. How do they do that in the movie?
Right. So, I mean, they obviously show that someone is dreaming, and, it kind of blurs reality. So, sometimes it makes it very clear that this is a dream. As it moves on to, like, some of these other accounts and things, it starts to blur the line a little bit. Where people are just kind of getting, like, these waking visions and whatever, and they're not really sure what's real or not. But that's where this kind of German expressionist style really shines, because, if it's not something you're familiar with, it's very much these, like, kind of everything is up front is normal, and then everything in the background is this kind of, like, wavy, artistic, kind of mix of things. And so it shows a lot of this, like, they're having these visions and dreams of Rilia, the island where Cthulhu lives.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, again, going back to that, like, Cyclopean style, I guess is what you call it then.
Yeah.
That's not a word that's ever used in the movie, but...
Understandable.
Right. These kind of, like, weird blocky things, and kind of some of them are, like, topsy-turvy, and it's just, like, kind of this weird, like, funhouse maze almost.
Yeah, I think that sounds pretty on par for what would be described in the book. I'm honestly pretty impressed with, like, the Lovecraft Society is... not necessarily... I mean, they're like a fan club. You wouldn't expect them necessarily to do that. A lot of times fan clubs do these passion projects and come up a bit short. But I don't know if they were professional filmmakers or professional storytellers or anything like that. But it sounds like they really put their heart and creativity into this and did something really interesting.
Yeah, like it was never going to be something that was, going to go head-to-head with anything at the box office or anything like that, but like it's definitely a cool passion project, and like if there was ever going to be a very direct adaptation, then this is about as close as you can get, I think.
I definitely want to see this movie. I have not seen it, but we'll buy that DVD, give them some support, give our role-playing gang some support. Okay, so the second part talks about what happened before Wilcox. So in the first part, as I said, Thurston is often talking about how he thinks Wilcox was taking advantage of Professor Angle. And then they jump back in time to Inspector Legras, which is where Professor Angle first learned about Cthulhu. And they're at an like archaeological society thing in some town. Let's say St. Louis. And that might actually be right.
It could be. I don't remember.
But he is a professor of Semitic languages, but he still goes to this because he's so well known. And this inspector shows up with this statuette that basically seizes everyone's attention. Mm-hmm. That's Inspector Lagros. And they go on to talk about how he found it from a voodoo cult, and how they're trying to bring back Cthulhu, and how when Cthulhu comes back, the world will be full of, like, they use the term orgiastic.
Wow.
I've never heard that word before. Like, it's just bizarre. And this is also where I feel like the racism really starts to shine, where you're
it's
like...
always these other tribes. And,
yeah. And this is where I really started to notice that white men were affected through dreams predominantly, whereas indigenous people and people of color were practicing these things.
Right.
And they
were actively, like, members of this cult that were worshipping.
Yes, exactly. And that's where they talk about Greenland, where a different professor has encountered. So there's some debate about if the word Greenlandic includes immigrants to Greenland or not.
Okay.
But the native Greenlanders, or Inuit Greenlanders, which is not the term they use, they do say Eskimo in the book.
In the movie, they use, like, the M-E-A-U-X spelling.
That's
too.
how they
Is
spell
that
it in the original, yeah. I actually, that was interesting. I have that huge, hefty Lovecraft book that, frankly, I never read because it's way too big and I don't know why I bought it. So I had started reading that, and I noticed it was spelled with the O at the end. And then I picked up a ebook from my library, Support Your Local Library, and I noticed they were spelling it, the AUX version, which is really interesting.
I'm pretty sure that's the original.
Yeah, and it's just, the whole thing, I was reading it, and it's definitely written in that, like, old-timey English. I would actually recommend you listen to it first if you have trouble reading, because some of the readers really get across the meaning without you being like, what the heck is this sentence structure? And I love weird sentence structure,
sure.
But it could be a little bit confusing. But that is really where we start to see, a lot of these terms were not considered racist by white people back in those days,
right.
But using these terms that they didn't put thought into, and that he's talking about, again, cults in India, and they talked about native unrest in India, and it's like, dude, those are Indians.
It's maybe the colonialism is the problem.
Yeah, and how, like, all these white people in India and stuff are talking about the native unrest, but they're not affected. They're not acting it out. They are the ones who are being affected, like in their dreams or in other ways.
Yeah.
Same with the people on the boat. They aren't acting. They stumble upon this stuff and then are driven to insanity.
And there's, like, I don't know, there's, like, an interesting element of it to me where it's like, it's definitely from a place of racism.
Yeah.
No doubt about that.
Yeah.
But it's also, like, it's partially, I think, because, like, I don't know. It's, like, to me, there's this element of, like, these indigenous cultures are more, like, in tune to reality of the earth, and these, like, white people are so, like, above it, almost, that they don't realize the reality of it. So they're, like, a step removed, and that ends up, like, being their folly in a way. Yeah. Which is, like, I don't know if that's purposeful or not, but there's, like, definitely a subtext of that to me.
And I think you see that a lot in some of these older stories where, especially, like, we live in the United States, so we see a lot of these Native American stories where these people are considered so, like, uncultured because of their practices. But now, in 2023, and, the past few years, we've been seeing a lot of people go, oh, the Native Americans were right.
Right. Like, especially when it comes to, like, land maintenance and things like that.
Yeah, and so their appreciation for, no matter how they practiced this appreciation for the land, be it through rituals or chanting or whatever, it also came with this understanding of the earth being this old being, and respecting that. And I would say Lovecraft flipped that, and this old being is going to bring about chaos and orgies. Mm-hmm. So I definitely don't think...
All hail Cthulhu.
All hail Cthulhu. I don't think Lovecraft did that on purpose, but I think now through a modern lens, we can really look at it and be like, yeah, because they knew.
Right.
They have these old, rich cultures, and that's what you're actually writing about, but you completely don't understand it, and you came up with Dr. Tentacle Head. You know, and we're like...
That's a much better name.
They would worship this weird dragonoid human cephalopod, rather than being like, oh, this is a rich culture steeped in history about celebrating the earth, or maybe not even celebrating the earth, you know? And the fact also of the matter is that every single, like, BIPOC culture is also participating in these, you know, cult activities.
Yeah.
It's so reductive.
Yeah.
It's so, like, oh, yeah, every vaguely brown person is going to be doing this. They all have the same culture. And it's like, no, again, the Greenlandic people are going to be completely different from, like, the people in Louisiana who do practice voodoo. And there's a huge reclamation movement going on right now, which I think is awesome. And then, like, in India, those would be completely different as well. Yeah. But then, through the lens of the colonists and these white American men, which, by the way, there are, like, no women in the story. It's, you know, completely lost my train of thought. But you get what I mean, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it is like everyone's kind of painted with the same brush for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, on another hand, I do like think it's somewhat cool, like just the fact that it's like such an international thing. Not that it's like celebrating that per se, but like I like that the scope of the story goes from like, you know, and this goes for a lot of his writing, I think, but just kind of like from his perspective of like, you know, he always has like his little New England town that's being plagued by this kind of thing because that was his experience growing up and stuff. But that it becomes this like worldwide thing, and that's even before this like cataclysmic event, you know, of Cthulhu returning and taking over. Like there's all these like little pockets of secrets about it, you know, throughout the world, which I do think that element is cool.
Yeah.
Just obviously not presented in a great way.
Yeah, and my understanding is that he really explored the world through books.
Yeah.
And being kind of this coddled, unadventurous man, white man in the late 1800s, early 1900s, he was probably also seeking out works that were written by people like him.
Yeah.
And this was about the time when India was kind of beginning to see a lot of unrest. And I think there was constantly unrest under the colonials, but they had already started trying to get rid of what people call the British Raj, but it's the British colonizer regime. I don't like using the term Raj. So he's definitely learning about the world through a lens that is too similar to his own.
Yeah.
And again, he was extremely xenophobic to begin with. So I think his fear of other people really shows through.
And that is important context. I mean, like, obviously he had a general fear of people, not just people different than him, but, like, you know, that obviously gets amplified when the more different somebody is, the more afraid that you're going to be if that's the type of person you are.
Yeah.
But it is important context to, I mean, like, even the word racism and the concept of it was only about 20 years old at that time.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like, yeah, he's a racist for sure, but it's just like, you know, you have to look at things in that particular lens and
absolutely
realize that, he's pouring through these books that are giving a very specific worldview.
Yeah, and he was not going in with this willingness to necessarily understand other cultures or embrace them as they are. It was just feeding into his, like, frankly terrible anxiety and agoraphobia and xenophobia. And I mean, even nowadays we see people with mental illness are often the ones who are targeted by people who have extremely outdated and conservative views. You know, trans people are disproportionately attacked, right? And then they, like, latch on to other people to, like, convince them, like, oh, they're gonna be bad. And, like, you have anxiety, well, let me amplify that anxiety.
Yeah, it's all preying on it for sure.
Something you might find really interesting, and I don't know if this happens at all in the book, but Lovecraft liked science, but I think he was also a little bit afraid of science. And he says, the opening line of the short story is, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but some day the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the light into the peace and safety of a new dark age."
Yeah.
So I almost think he was afraid to learn new things.
He was, and that's, I mean, I think that's the whole idea is, why Thurston is told not to look into this.
Yeah.
Why the more that you uncover, the more danger you're in.
Yeah.
It's a way of thinking called cosmic indifferentism.
Oh, I haven't heard of this.
Yeah, that's kind of like what's attributed to him and the way that he thought about the world, where it is this more like humans are only meant to know so much, and the more that you know will not make you a better person, it will make you go crazy.
Yeah. I think, not to get too philosophical, but if you go into anything accepting that maybe you won't understand it at first, but you are curious and open and, kind, then you won't go crazy.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, I understand where he's coming from, and especially at such a kind of tumultuous time in history where so much stuff was being discovered, and, I could see it being scary, being, living in that time period, and now, obviously, we have much healthier ways to approach things like that, where you don't need to know everything, but you can try to understand things that are outside of your scope and stuff like that. But it is it's almost coming from that place of the curse of knowledge, right? The more that you learn, the more you realize what you don't know.
Yeah.
The more you realize harsh realities.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people even today where we have all this information available to us, but they still choose to put their head in the sand because, frankly, it's too scary.
Yeah.
To know too much.
Yeah.
And so I think that idea is really a really core piece of humanity, which I find very interesting, to see that perspective put out into this kind of more fantastical way.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea of nowadays you can surround yourself with different people so much easier. So we do see a lot of people actually breaking out of those ideals and realizing there's so much more to the world, and that's okay. Whereas, in Providence, Rhode Island in 1920, he's kind of surrounded by people like him.
Yeah.
And there was such a divide. I mean, racism was strong then. There was such a divide in all of these communities that you didn't get to just surround yourself with people unless you really made a huge active effort. And you have to go into that willing to either understand or be okay with not understanding.
Right. And I think that's the big point of it, is that even today, a lot of people are somewhat plagued by how much stuff we know.
Yeah.
And there's all these issues going on all over the world, and it's where do you put your focus and your attention and your care?
Yeah.
It gets very overwhelming very easily, but I think more it's just the idea of being open to things and to just try to care.
Yeah.
Instead of letting yourself, be completely overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or afraid of it, or feel like you have to know everything about everything.
Yeah. So, basically, part 2 of Call of Cthulhu is Lovecraft is racist.
Uh-huh.
Got it.
Okay. And so part 2 in the written story is also just detailing all of these things with these colleagues or whatever, and then that's where it stops.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah. And also, I do want to say that in 2005, we were starting to learn things like the term Eskimo is not an appropriate term to use. But I do want to cut a little bit of slack to the H.P. Lovecraft Society, just because they were trying to make an extremely faithful adaptation.
Oh, absolutely.
Whether or not that was the right or good thing to do, we can debate. We're not going to do that today. But I just want to point out that, like, they used the term and they used the old spelling because they were literally trying to recreate
pulling
the,
it straight from the book.
Exactly.
I'm pretty sure all the dialogue in that movie comes straight from the book.
Yeah, so I just want to point that out, that, you know, this is not to say the H.P. Lovecraft Society themselves is full of racists. No. They're probably a diverse, interesting group of people, but I don't know them.
The same as any group, like, you never know, but, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. But I don't want to make any assumptions based off of this one thing, you know.
No.
And they could be actively trying to improve what the term Lovecraftian means. That being said, I think you do have to remove the term from the definition.
Yes.
If we're going to progress like that. But
I mean, yeah, that's a whole other conversation.
Exactly.
I do agree with them using the original term as it was written just because of that. And
because of what they were doing.
I don't believe in changing things like that simply because, you know, if you're making a whole new version of something, like, yeah, sure, go ahead and change it and make it something that's, you know, more modern, that's fine. But, like, when you're faithfully recreating something, I have no problem with staying with that because it is a product of its time, and it's important to maintain that, like, knowledge of how people thought back then, and, you know, things like that. So I don't have any issue with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the third part, if we can move forward, is more about Thurston taking the initiative, I believe. And I say I believe because that's the part I did not reread. But my understanding is that's where he starts to seek out the man from the boat who survived, because there was only one survivor. Yeah,
there were two that made it. Well, we'll get to that. There were a group of survivors from the Emma who made it onto the Alert.
Yes.
And then they slowly get whittled away.
Yeah, so, well, let's talk about that. In the story, in the written word, they go from the Emma to the Alert. They find an island that's, like, uncharted. Maybe not in that order. And then they stumble upon the Cyclopean city and apparently release Cthulhu.
Yeah.
And only two of them make it out. And then the Alert is sailing around, not unlike the Demeter in Dracula, in my opinion, but that'll be a story for another day. Which I believe was written first. So I just want to say that maybe there's some inspiration there, because it really harkened back to that.
Yeah, I could see that.
So they wash up on shore, and these last two survivors, only one of them is alive, and one of them is clutching the statuette that, not Legras, but the Webb, Professor Webb, had found when they wash up in, I believe that's his word, they wash up in, like, Greenland or something. I don't
remember who went where.
Yeah, it's so confusing.
And in the movie, they don't really, like, they name a couple of the people, but I think even some of the people that are named in the book are not even named by name in the movie.
Yeah.
It's just not important.
Exactly. But this guy washes up, and he's clutching this thing, and then he moves to New Zealand, and then he moves to Norway. And he's the last survivor of the Alert. And he actually lives decently long.
Yeah.
My favorite part of this whole story is that Thurston goes to New Zealand to find out that this man is no longer in New Zealand, and then goes to Norway. There's like one sentence about him traveling to New Zealand. I'm like, well, what was the point, Lovecraft? Why did he bother going to New Zealand if you weren't even going to detail the research?
I think, I mean, to me, the reason behind that is just to show, like, the obsessive nature he was on, and like, how big this kind of quest was.
Yeah, I feel like he could have nailed it down a little bit more in the story, because it really is like, he went to New Zealand, he wasn't there, so he went to Norway, and he was dead.
And this, I mean, does it, like, literally not elaborate on anything that happened in New Zealand?
Not that I remember.
Because I feel like in the movie it said, I mean, it's like only like a minute or two, but it's like, he goes there, finds out, like, some information about where he is now, and then goes on his way.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's like that. That's like probably an exact quote from the book.
Yeah.
Is that he's like, he's out in New Zealand, you know.
Something else that's funny about all those sequences in the movie is that it does like that kind of like Indiana Jones style of like, you know, showing the the spots on the map.
Oh, yeah.
Go, you know.
Yeah,
exactly. Like
you watch the airplane fly over the map.
I kept playing that music in my head while that was happening.
Well, so, thought. Maybe this movie, it's silent, is best watched with the Indiana Jones soundtrack in the background.
Maybe.
When was the first Indiana Jones made?
1980.
Well, there you go. Problem solved. Lovecraft Society was inspired by Indiana Jones.
I'm pretty sure they pulled that idea from... I mean, it worked in the movie. It made a lot of sense.
I think they used to do that in, like, old movies, too.
They did,
but...
yeah. That is true. Like, in Indiana Jones, that's definitely, like, a harkening back to...
Yeah, because Indiana Jones is supposed to take place in, like, what, the 40s?
30s,
40s?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so movies back then would do stuff like that to be like, and then they traveled.
Right. No, I don't know, it worked. Also, I mean, it is a silent film, of course, but silent films do have a soundtrack. And the soundtrack in this movie was pretty good. Like, constantly very, like, kind of eerie and thrilling. Mm-hmm. And,
But would it be better with the Indiana Jones?
For those sequences? Absolutely.
Okay. So, Lovecraft Society, call us. We have a few tweaks to offer. Yeah. Mostly it's just get the license to the Indiana Jones soundtrack.
When you do your 4K re-release, you'll have to add that.
Do you know if this was filmed on film or on digital? Probably digital.
It's something, it was a very specific style. I forget what it's like Magnoscope or something like that. It's
something like proper old.
Specifically designed to be like a modern version of the old way of filming.
Okay, please excuse me while I type. Magnoscope.
Mythoscope, sorry.
Mythoscope. Oh, H.P. Lovecraft Society is the first thing that came up.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's something that they, like, coined themselves.
Good for them!
I don't know the technical details of how they did it, but it definitely is, like, a modern way of doing the old style.
Mythoscope. Let me see if I can find it on this page.
Like, they really stuck to, like, old school stuff. Like, all the effects for, like, Cthulhu and stuff, they're pretty low budget and stuff, but they're all, like, stop motion and...
Oh, wow.
It's pretty cool.
Stop motion is hard, too.
Yeah,
it's very time-consuming. So if anyone from the H.P. Lovecraft Society wants to, like, join us, I would love to talk to you. About this.
Because there's not a ton of information about this movie, you know, so...
Yeah.
I'm not really sure the technical details of how they did it.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I just went on their store. We can get a mug. Movies! Okay,
yeah, they have other movies.
Oh, wow. Okay, so I guess we'll be doing more of these.
Yeah, I don't know if they're direct... I didn't look at what they were. I don't know if they're direct adaptations of other stories, or if they're... just things that they made themselves, because I know they've written other stories just based on it, but...
Some of them look like they're real, like they have the color out of space.
Oh, yeah.
Spelled the American way, so they were unfaithful to Lovecraft, who I recognize was American, but at the time they spelled color with
yeah.
Okay, well, cool. I'll put that on the list for the future.
It's pretty interesting stuff. Like, I appreciate what they did. They're definitely, like, uber nerds about this stuff.
Yeah. And I would love to speak to any women of color, just BIPOC or like non-binary people they have, trans people they have in their group, and get their feelings. Because there's, oh my gosh, what's the author's name? He wrote the Ballad of Black Tom.
Yeah, I don't remember his name.
Oh my gosh, Thomas Legault. No, that's a completely wrong guy. Oh my gosh. Well, he says in his dedication of the Ballad of Black Tom. Let me look this up before I completely... Victor Lavelle. That's who. He's a black author who said in his dedication at the beginning of the book something about like a thank you to Lovecraft, but he addresses his like conflicting feelings.
Yeah.
That story is based on the horror at Red Hook, but it's, a slightly different retelling, and it's obviously done from the point of view of a black man. So I think it's really interesting to see all these, like, BIPOC takes.
Yeah.
And
I think it's super cool.
Yeah, and as a woman of color, like a mixed gender queer woman of color, I feel very conflicted about Lovecraft.
Sure.
And talking about him, for me, I always have to bring up that he was kind of a racist.
Yeah, it should be a conflicting thing.
Yeah. But I can recognize, what he did.
Yeah. That's why, like, I'm fully on board with, like, appreciating the works for what it is, what it turned into, but, like, again, I think the biggest thing that Lovecraft gave us was these ideas and this, like, kind of new atmosphere and way of looking at things, and so, like, to take that and run with it, I think is a really, really good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, but back to the story, because we genuinely just keep talking, like, we keep bashing on Lovecraft, but it is interesting to think about, like, his work. Vox, there's an article in Vox where they basically said, like, he's a person where you cannot separate the art from the artist. Like, he is so much in his work. And I think that's true, and I think that's why we keep circling back to all of these things.
No, it's an important aspect of it. I mean, to me, it's not one of those things where that means you just, like, completely ignore his work, because historically it is important.
Yeah.
Like, these are all elements that should be discussed alongside.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I know I made that Beatles comparison, but the Beatles were much better people than Lovecraft.
Yeah. Generally speaking, yes.
Yeah. I mean, they
had their own problems.
They had their problems, yeah. But they, some of them are still alive. They were very much about peace and love. As John Lennon once said, with all the peace and love in the world, stop sending me mail design.
Right.
So, at the end of the story, Thurston is kind of wondering how he's going to die.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because at the beginning of the story, they say that he's dead. Does he die, or how does it end?
Yeah, so he does die, and then he kind of passes things on to someone else. I forget exactly who it was, like a protege of his, or something like that. I can't remember. Oh no, he's doing like psychiatry appointments.
Okay.
To kind of talk through his, like, nearing madness.
Yeah.
And so he, shares all of this with his psychiatrist, and then he, like, eventually, like, quote unquote passes the torch to the psychiatrist. And then the movie ends by his psychiatrist hearing the Call of Cthulhu.
Okay, so that's actually something that maybe I think the Lovecraft Society failed on. Because it is so fascinating to me that at the end of the book, so some of the deaths in the book, Angle and one other person, they think that cultists killed them. In the beginning, it's your first instance of racism where a black man jostles Professor Angle while he's coming home and he ends up dead. So it's fascinating that you know Thurston is dead at the beginning of the book, and then at the end he just says, I wonder how I'm going to die. And I don't want anyone to know about any of this. So I almost think it would have been more interesting to see him, like, panicking and scared, and then you just know he's dead. You don't know how he died or why he died. And then maybe you could hint at someone finding it, because you do wonder, like, is the cycle going to continue? What's going to happen? Who settles his estate?
Right.
He clearly wrote all of this down. That's clearly what this is supposed to reflect. So I thought it was very interesting to leave that end on mystery and questioning what happened to Thurston. Who figures out what's next? Where does this go?
Yeah, that's a good point, because, like, it makes sense for him to also come to that same realization of, like, don't go down this road, kind of thing. Which I want to say he also warns the psychiatrist of the same thing, but it's just, like, one of those, like, too little too late kind of things.
Yeah.
But I like it from the aspect of, continuing to show that this will continue, like, you can't get away from the Call of Cthulhu, basically. Yeah. But like you said, there's other ways that it could have been done.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I'm trying to find... There's this term they use called ethical psychiatry. And it was practiced around the time that the lobotomy was popularized. Let me look this up real quick. So, okay, that would be the 1940s. So the fact that there's a psychiatrist also, and this is something that it, like, immediately struck me. modern psychiatry is very much about sitting down and talking.
Yeah.
Psychiatry back then, Thurston would have been frickin' locked up in a room with a straitjacket. So that's, again, actually, like, if you're going to do that faithful adaptation, I think they would have had to not have that modern psychiatry touch. Because, like, again, 1940s, the quote use of ethical psychiatry, they did begin doing talk therapy. But they were also like, hey, lobotomies are pretty cool, right?
We can fix this real quick.
Yeah, so I'm actually really surprised they did that.
Yeah.
Because that's like a huge stray from the story, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't remember exactly how it unfolds in that way, but, like, I'm pretty sure it's also, like, you know, this guy's very doubtful, whatever, and then, like, Thurston dies, and then he hears the call, and he realizes it was true.
Yeah. So I guess probably what they were trying to do is how can we have the story continue? But I think that was just not the right way to do it, in my opinion. Yeah. Again, I need to see the movie, but I really loved how this story ended.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, because I often critique Lovecraft a lot for his writing. I love bashing Lovecraft. But I thought that ending was really good, because he's just like, and how am I going to die? Because he's telling the story.
Yeah.
So I loved that it just ended on this complete cliffhanger of, like, what happened to Thurston? Did he die? Oh, he did die, but when? How? Does someone... Like, you have so many questions. And that was so cool. And that's part of what makes you want to continue examining the story.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, in large part, Lovecraft loves this sense of a mystery in all of his stories. He loves not describing things.
Yeah.
Which, whether or not that's a good thing, is very much part of why people have continued to explore it. It's because we want to answer these questions he left unanswered. And in a way, they kind of answer that. And they don't leave that sense of mystery. It's more like, oh, what happens to the psychiatrist? Rather than being like, there's a million questions bouncing around in my head right now, and I need answers. And is this a cycle that's going to continue forever, or is this the end?
Right.
But you can kind of guess, because you're consuming it, that it's not the end, right?
Of course.
Someone discovered this. It was found among the papers of the late Francis Thurston.
Yeah.
So...
And you can also, of course, guess that, like, he probably died in the same way that everyone else did, by just simply going mad.
Yeah. Well, no, these people, people who were investigating didn't go mad. They were killed by cultists.
Right, but I'm saying, like, the people that saw Cthulhu, many of them died from madness.
Yeah.
Thurston he lasts a lot longer while investigating this stuff, but eventually, like, he dies because it's not explicitly said, but he's starting to go more and more mad. Okay,
so that's a movie thing.
Yeah.
That's not in the book.
Okay.
Which, again, is cool, because it could be like, well, does he go try to find Cthulhu? I think he doesn't, but... Oh, no, he actually explicitly says he does not try to go to see Cthulhu, I think, or his grandfather. But it's just, like, it's fascinating that, like, there are so many questions you could have asked at the end of the book. You could have asked, does he lose his mind? Is he like these people on the boats? Does he actually eventually give in and go? No, he never hears the Call of Cthulhu either. That's all, like, these artists who are having dreams.
Okay.
So that's not something that, like, his great-uncle heard. Or anything like that. But I think that's just... And I think that's part of why it's like artists are affected and scientists are not.
Yeah.
But it was just like... Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I, having not seen the movie, would say that I think the story does a better job of the ending.
Okay.
So, we're kind of, I think, getting sort of toward the end. But let's talk a little bit about the atmosphere in the world.
Yeah.
So you were saying that the music felt very tense and
definitely
eerie and spooky.
Yeah. Definitely goes back to that, you know, again, all these 1920s movies, Caligari, Nosferatu, like any of that kind of stuff. Does it play with, like, the shadows and stuff? Because in black and white, obviously, you can't use a color palette, but you can still play with shadows. A little bit. One thing I really want to do is just show you some, like, German Expressionism.
Yeah.
To kind of give you the idea. Like,
Okay.
here's some, like, paintings in the style.
Oh, yeah, so it is that play of, like, dark and light and harsh lines, but also, like, shadows. And...
Yeah, like, it's all these wacky things. Like, if you've ever seen, I forget the name of the painting, but, like, the stairs that go nowhere.
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
thing. Like, it's very much that type of thing, and a lot of, like, bending of things, and it blends the shadows into, like, reality, and, like...
It's almost kind of like a very... clean Picasso done in black and white.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, like, I mean, like, here's a still from Nosferatu.
Oh, yeah, again, the shadows.
You know, the shadows.
Yeah.
And I would say that the shadows are, like, on the lesser end of this one, but, like, it's definitely a big part of it. Like, here's the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
Okay,
You know,
and that's the
like
poster,
kind of,
but
like,
yeah.
Yeah, this kind of blend of things in the background.
Yeah, so they really play, particularly with angular and, like, sweeping, curving shapes.
Exactly.
Yeah, and things are slightly askew, and then in that askewness, they're able to play with light and dark and shadows.
Yeah, so they definitely do that, like, especially during the dream sequences and stuff, and when people hear the call.
Yeah.
And then a little bit so when they actually come face to face with Cthulhu and Rillia.
Do you see Cthulhu in the story?
Yes.
What?
Because you're seeing it through the lens of the people who were on the boat.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so you see them on the island, and you see them, you know, some of them start to go mad before he even shows up, and then again this door opens, and Cthulhu emerges, and that's the part where they use, like, stop motion animation.
How...
So he is very much, you know, going back to the way you were asking about his appearance, like, he very much is that head with the tentacles, like, the very classic Cthulhu style. He has wings, like, he looks like he could be vaguely scaly, but he's... like a very, like, vaguely anthropomorphic figure as well.
And again, you watched him 360p, so we might not have seen the scales.
The scales and stuff, but it is that very classic look.
Oh, okay, that's really cool. Did they lean, and this might not have been an intentional choice, but does it lean toward that very, like, choppy 1920s, 1930s, 40s stop motion, or was it fairly smooth? Okay.
Oh, yeah, definitely very choppy. And I think purposefully,
Yeah, okay, that's really, really cool.
Yeah,
because,
it, like, looks like a, like, B monster movie kind of thing. Yeah,
that's fun. It's, in the story, like, they do release Cthulhu, but they don't really talk about what he looks like or anything like that.
Other than those descriptions.
Yeah, which, again, I think is very interesting, because Lovecraft likes to avoid describing his monsters. So to say there are all these bas reliefs and everything, and so we have an idea of what he looks like, but we recognize it's artistic interpretation.
Right.
And then suddenly, like, Cthulhu's there, but you don't really get to know what people actually describe him as. That was quite interesting, but I think it's really fun that they did explore, like, all of this happening. Though, I wonder if it would have helped the atmosphere to have those shadows interplay more in the, like, real world scenes. Because that sense of darkness and, like, foreboding, like, you showed me the still of Nosferatu, and it's his silhouette cast on a wall with a fence. And that stuff doesn't feel like the German Expressionism, like, it's not abstract or doesn't hold an element of abstractness, but it does add the sense of tension.
Right.
So that's interesting, but again, I have not seen them.
And I mean that, you know, it does still, like, keep an air of mystery around it, where it's like, you see him, but you don't really see, like, his full form all at once.
Okay.
Like, you kind of see bits and pieces.
Okay,
like,
that's cool.
Yeah, so I think it deals with it pretty well.
It sounds like a really interesting take on it, to say the least. I
enjoyed it. I thought it was quite nice.
The book, I would say it feels like you're reading a mystery. It doesn't really, it's very epistolary, so it feels like you're reading an account. Which is to say that maybe there's not as much tension and things like that, but it very much does invest you in the mystery sense of it and the, like, what's going to happen, what does this mean, who is this? And I think the whole point of the story is to present you with these circumstances in kind of an interesting order, and then wrap it up with a lot of, like, what? In a good way.
I think it's going for that idea of, like, you know, since it's, like, second, third-hand accounts, it's like, well, could it be real, you know, like that kind of thing, and so that is what adds it, you know. Like, in other words, I think 100 years ago it would have been much more scary than it is now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and they always talk about how, like, the first time they did skeleton stop motion in the 1920s, people were fleeing the theaters.
Right.
And now we look at it and it's like, hello, my baby, hello, my darling. And you're like, yeah, that's so
goofy,
spooky.
Goofy fun time now.
Yeah.
Yeah, you really have to try to place yourself in that setting. And, you know, I feel like it would have been scary reading that.
Absolutely.
At least enough to send a shiver up your spine.
Yeah, and I think the fear comes from the unknown, which Lovecraft himself is very afraid of.
Of course.
But we're all afraid of that a little bit and not knowing what's going to happen in the future. So we talked a bit about the reception of the movie. It's not well known.
No.
At all.
It is well appreciated by those that have seen it. It did have, like, a little bit of, like, a, film festival circuit run at various places, and it was well received at all of those. It did win a couple of awards.
Good.
But yeah, just generally not well known, but the people who have seen it, it's pretty well appreciated.
Yeah, and with the story, Lovecraft was not appreciated at his time, and he, as I said, he mostly published in pulp magazines like Weird Tales, and Weird Tales actually really tried to support him throughout his career. I would say they probably were his biggest fans at the time and seemed to really believe in him, at least from my brief reading about him. But, I think the story was not actually very well received at the time. Maybe, again, with, like, a cult following, ironically. But, yeah, so quite unlike the movie, it was both underread and underappreciated. Whereas the movie has not been viewed a lot, but it is appreciated by those who have seen it.
Yeah.
Do you have any fun facts you want to share with us about the movie?
No, I don't think so. One other comment about the reception is that Lovecraft himself considered it, quote, one of his middling stories. Yeah. He didn't find it to be one of his favorites, even though it so informed, like, the world that he created and kind of the mythology. The story itself he did not consider one of his best, which is just interesting to me, since it is one of the more enduring ones. Yeah, absolutely. And Call of Cthulhu was written pretty early on in his writing career. Yeah. But his writing career was quite short-lived because he was short-lived. Right. So yeah, this was only, 8 years before his death or something that it was published?
Something like that. I can't remember. Yeah, I think I said it in my description of him. Let's see.
He only had about 12 years of being published.
Yeah, it was only 9 years. That's what it was. It was published 9 years before he passed away. I don't really have any fun facts about this other than it was inspired by his dreams, and I already said that.
Yeah. And I mean, something that we've touched on here and there that I just think is really worth mentioning is that, again, this isn't a story that I think is, timeless in a way or has, like, been enduring because of the story itself or because of, like, great writing or any of these things. It's specifically because of the ideas that he came across with and some of the imagery that he generated. Yeah. And that's why it's just something that, like, people have taken and run. So I would say, like, the vast majority of people probably know, at least that are, like, somewhat tuned into pop culture, like, know about Cthulhu. Yeah. But probably a very small amount of them have ever even read the story. Yeah, absolutely. You just know about the figure itself and, like, he pops up in various different media. And, like, so it's just very interesting to me that, like, again, something that was considered unfilmable has been, the source of multiple, like, tabletop games. It's been the source of, multiple video games. Yeah. And people have taken it all these goofy ways and these very serious, dramatic ways. And, like, the people have just played with it so much and that it created this whole, the Cthulhu mythology kind of thing with all the great old ones and all this stuff. And, like, it's a really interesting thing that it generated all of that, but that the story itself is, nothing to write home about necessarily.
No, not really. And I do think it's that he really set up this air of mystery also makes us want to explore that a little bit more and get answers. Mm-hmm. And this, like, you can kind of feel at the end that it's never ending. So that's why so many people are able to come back and do this stuff. And I keep thinking about the game The Sinking City, which we played and we really enjoyed, but it does delve into the Cthulhu mythos a bit, and it also has that idea of, like, does this end? How does it end?
Right.
It's, driving people to insanity.
Yep.
And it's really interesting.
So there's a lot of things that can be played with. I mean, I'm also very interested by the fact that it was considered unfilmable, because to be so direct with the adaptation, I feel like this 2005 film, is like the only way that it could be done that way.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's a lot of ways that, like, in other words, there's lots of things that have elements of it.
Yeah.
But I'm really surprised that no one has made, like, a slightly different, like, from a different perspective, but still telling the same story. Like, I do feel like you could do a full-length narrative that would obviously not be like that kind of, all the what do you call it, epistolary?
Yeah.
It might not be from that perspective, but, like, I still feel like you could create something like that. So I'm just kind of surprised that no one has ever done that, considering how, like, pervasive the story is.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, because you could probably do something like Professor Engel's perspective, where he starts exploring it, and then suddenly he dies, and his nephew picks it up, or great-nephew, or whatever. And, like, I mean, I see point-and-click adventure written all over this.
Yeah,
there has to
true.
be a point-and-click Cthulhu game, actually. We're going to have to find that.
Maybe, I can't remember.
Yeah.
There's just been so many different versions of it.
Yeah. I mean, the Sinking City is, like, almost point-and-click, but there's also shooting.
Yeah.
Terrifying shooting.
Things that haunt you.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm just very fascinated by its kind of enduring legacy, given the fact that, like, so many people probably haven't read it.
Yeah.
And, like, just all the pieces that are put into others. Like, even the Necronomicon, like, that's another big thing that's, that was invented through not this story specifically, but through the kind of Cthulhu mythos.
Yeah.
And, like, that is used in so many different things.
Yeah.
And has been adapted, even if it doesn't go by that name, like, the concept.
Yeah.
I was reading that, like, there was a back and forth at one point about, like, the only other written version of something like that, like this kind of cursed book, was in The King in Yellow, which I know that you've read at least partway through.
I read the whole thing.
But yeah, so people were wondering if, like, he had gotten inspiration from that, because there's a book like that in one of the stories in there. But some people later said that he had read it after. He did read it in his life, but it was after the story was published. But I don't know. It's just fascinating to me how much of it has continued to be used.
Yeah, and The King is Yellow. We'll have to talk about that one day.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on the movie? What's your review? How many stars are you giving it?
We don't do star ratings on this podcast. You know that.
Yeah, well, I needed a segue.
I really appreciated it. I want to view it in a better quality, just because I feel like it was pretty visual in, like, kind of an interesting way.
Yeah.
I like it's so old school and, like, again, like, kind of choppy and stuff, but, like, there is still beauty in that. Like, I really like some of those 20s movies. Mm-hmm. So I think they did an excellent job of capturing that style. And it's something that I definitely have, like, a soft spot in my heart for, and it just seems like if you were ever going to make an adaptation, that's it. Like, that's the best you can do. And like you said, there were some of these, like, little tweaks and changes, and
like the Indiana Jones music.
But they all seem to fit, the visual medium, which is, of course, something that we always hit on, is that some of these changes make a better, faithful adaptation than it would be if you just went one-to-one, because it gets it across in a different way, in a different medium. So, yeah, I really enjoyed it.
I would say I really liked the story. It was pretty easy. I listened to a pretty good version, but it had music with it that was, like, honestly, I felt like it kind of brought it down, because there would be these large gaps with just music, and I was like, I'm not listening to an album. I want to listen to a book.
That kind of drives me crazy in audiobooks. They do that, especially in, like, sci-fi and fantasy. They do that a lot. Yeah,
but the reader was really good, and I wish I could remember what his name was, but I cannot. It was someone's Spine Chillers. It was, like, one of those series.
Oh, okay.
Like Tom Clancy's Revenge, but this is different.
Sure.
It's not Tom Clancy. So, what do we think? Is the book better than the movie?
I feel like that's a very hard thing to answer.
Yeah, I would say the book is better just because of the ending.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
I really, really liked that, like, how it ended. I thought it was so well done. And frankly, I think they could have also started the movie with, like, his gravestone.
Yeah.
And then you go through it and you're like, you see him, like, writing. Like, there are ways you can really be faithful to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm willing to agree with you on that it was, like, a really fun thing to watch, but that at the same time it's like, that version of it only exists because of the very specific way that the story was written.
Yeah.
It's not ever going to be this kind of, like, blockbuster thing.
No.
And, like, I mean, really, the winner out of all of this is the intellectual property itself.
Yeah.
It's not the story or the movie. It's just the ideas that came from it, so...
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's, like, multiple versions of it that are probably better than either one, but, like, as far as adaptations go, like, yeah.
It was a really faithful adaptation. And they did it justice. Well, that about sums up our thoughts, but before we sign off... Alan.
Here we go.
It's time for a game!
Here we go. Do we need to put, like, game show music?
I was just thinking it would be like a ba-da-da-da-da!
I'll just let you do that every
time. I need a button board.
Yeah, you do.
When we get our full setup. Button board.
Alright.
So the rules, guess the movie based on the tagline. Some movies have multiple taglines. I've just picked one. Genres are pulled from IMDb and Letterboxd. Actors are the first actors listed as starring in IMDb. Synopses are all pulled from IMDb. Thank you, IMDb, for your hard work.
Always.
You ready?
Yes.
The tagline is, he came as the caretaker, but this hotel had its own guardians who'd been there a long time.
The Shining.
It is The Shining. You are welcome. Ba-da-da-da-da.
Thanks for a gimme.
You're welcome. I thought it would be fun to do one that we'd already done the movie for. But
I've never heard that tagline.
It's a terrible tagline.
It's not very good.
It's a really bad tagline.
It does very succinctly describe the story. So
I feel like it's more appropriate for the book than the movie.
Yeah,
but
that makes sense.
We already did that episode. It's a 1980 horror thriller. Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, Danny Lloyd. The Shining. We've already talked about it.
Just go listen to episode 1.
Episode 1, yeah. And this is episode 3. So that's all for now. Thank you for listening to In Contrast. I'm Nisha.
And I am Alan.
Let us know what you think and your opinions. You can find us on @InContrastPod on Instagram and Twitter. Next up, we're going to be talking about... What are we talking about?
The Phantom of the Opera.
The Phantom of the Opera, which I've been wanting to read. And, Alan, I don't think you've seen the movie.
I have seen parts of it because my cousin was obsessed with it, but I have not seen it in many, many years and never all at once.
Yeah. Well, I keep singing the music from it. I actually don't like the movie. Spoiler.
Oh, wow.
So I'm really excited.
But there's an old one and then the, also 2005 one.
Yeah, so there might even be multiple, but...
I will most likely watch both.
Yeah, so if you can't tell, we didn't really prepare for this outro. And I want to just disclaimer say, if this episode was really messy, that's because I took a sleeping pill last night and I am not awake yet.
I mean, sometimes that's a good thing, you know?
Yeah, I was really honest.
To keep it loosey-goosey.
Yeah, and that's why there was so much bashing on the Beatles.
Oh boy, well you just do that any time of day, so...
Anyway, so next time we'll do The Phantom of the Opera. I can't remember who it's by. I'm so sorry. And we'll ask the important question, is the book really better than the movie?